Scott Foster was 42 and worked warehouse systems on the industrial edge of Detroit. Most people believed his ex-wife left because he wasted 6 years building useless software in his garage. He drove a dented Honda War, faded work boots, and carried homemade turkey sandwiches in wax paper. What nobody knew was that Scott's side project had just been acquired for $340 million. At 8:12 on a freezing Tuesday morning, his phone rang beside the loading dock. "Mr. Foster," the voice said. Northstar signed. The coffee slipped from his hand. "Before we continue, comment your country and local time below. And if you enjoy stories about quiet people proving everyone wrong, subscribe to the channel." 6 years earlier, Scott Foster still believed silence could save a marriage. The house in Novi sat at the end of a curved suburban cul-de-sac, lined with identical maple trees and black SUVs. The mortgage was expensive. The neighbors smiled too much. Every driveway looked pressure washed before sunrise. Scott never fit there. Most mornings he left before daylight in steel-toe boots and a gray Carhartt jacket that permanently smelled faintly of machine oil. He worked 12-hour shifts managing warehouse logistics systems for mid-states freight distribution outside Detroit. The job paid enough to keep the house, barely. Vanessa hated when he wore work clothes inside. "You leave dirt everywhere," she said one Thursday evening while standing in the kitchen island, light arms crossed over a cream-colored sweater that probably cost more than Scott's monthly grocery bill. Scott looked down at the floor automatically. There were no visible marks. "I'll clean it," he said quietly. "That's not the point. It was never the point." By then, the garage had already become its own world. A folding table sat beneath exposed rafters, beside old storage bins labeled Christmas and Taxes 2014. 3 mismatched monitors glowed late into the night, while whiteboards leaned against unfinished drywall covered in handwritten shipping routes, fraud percentages, and cargo timing patterns. Scott spent years studying one thing most companies ignored: small theft, not armed robbery, not cyber attacks, tiny invisible manipulations buried inside freight systems, fuel invoices inflated by 3%, duplicate vendor payments hidden under alternate routing codes, drivers logging fake delays to bill extra labor hours. Millions disappeared that way every year because nobody looked long enough to notice patterns. Scott noticed patterns. That was what RouteHawk really was. Not flashy AI, not Silicon Valley fantasy, just 6 years of patient observation built into software. Vanessa called it the garage thing. At first she tolerated it. Then she mocked it. Eventually she started performing that mockery for other people. One Friday night they hosted dinner for 2 neighboring couples. Scott grilled steaks in 30-degree weather, while laughter drifted through the kitchen windows behind him. He could hear Vanessa clearly. "He thinks he's building the next billion-dollar tech company," she said. Someone laughed. Another voice asked, "Wait, seriously?" "Oh, completely serious," Vanessa replied. "Every night. Midnight coding sessions. Like some middle-aged Zuckerberg with a Home Depot workbench." More laughter. Scott flipped the steaks without reacting. Snow gathered on the shoulders of his jacket. Inside, glasses clinked softly. The thing about humiliation was that it sounded smaller from another room. Later that night, Vanessa found him in the garage, staring at lines of shipment data scrolling across one monitor. You could have stayed inside and acted normal for one evening. Scott kept typing. "I made dinner. You disappeared. I was cleaning. You're always cleaning or coding or organizing spreadsheets." Her voice sharpened. "Do you realize how embarrassing this is?" Scott finally looked at her. Vanessa had once loved how calm he was. Back when they were 28 and renting a tiny apartment near Royal Oak, she used to say his steadiness made her feel safe. Now she looked at him like stillness was failure. "What exactly is the plan here?" she asked. "You think one of these giant tech companies is going to knock on our door because you built warehouse software in a garage? Scott hesitated, not because he doubted himself, because he understood something Vanessa didn't. The people who solved expensive problems rarely looked impressive while building the solution. "I'm close," he said. Vanessa laughed immediately. Not loud, worse. Short, automatic, dismissive, like a reflex. "You've been close for 4 years." Then she walked back inside. Scott listened to the sliding glass door shut behind her. The garage heater rattled softly overhead. On the screen, another fraud cluster appeared, inside a transportation dataset from Ohio. 3 vendors, repeating invoice splits, timing overlap every 17 days. Scott highlighted the pattern and saved the file. At 1:14 a.m., he finally went inside. Vanessa was asleep with the television still glowing blue across the bedroom walls. Scott stood there for a moment looking at her, not angry, just tired. The next changes happened slowly. Vanessa started spending more weekends downtown Detroit and Chicago with a new social circle tied to startup investors, real estate brokers, and consultants who talked loudly about scaling things over expensive dinners. That was where Ryan Mercer appeared. Scott first heard his name while unloading groceries. Vanessa stood at the counter texting while smiling at her phone. "Ryan says Detroit logistics tech is about to explode," she said casually. Scott placed milk in the refrigerator. "Who's Ryan, a consultant out of Chicago?" "Smart guy. He actually understands business." Scott nodded once. That was all. Weeks later, Ryan appeared in person during a backyard cookout. Tall, expensive haircut, navy wool coat despite mild weather. The kind of man who touched people's shoulders while talking. Ryan shook Scott's hand firmly. "Vanessa tells me you're building software. Something like that." "What kind fraud detection?" Ryan smiled immediately. "There's serious money in that." Scott noticed the shift right away. Most people lost interest after hearing technical details. Ryan leaned closer. "What's your model using behavioral tracking invoice correlation?" Vanessa rolled her eyes dramatically from the patio chair. "Trust me, you don't want details. He'll trap you in spreadsheet prison." Ryan laughed with her, but he kept watching Scott carefully. That night after everyone left, Scott walked back into the garage around midnight. The monitors were dark. One small green notification blinked near the corner of his screen. Remote access log updated. Scott frowned. He opened the activity history. Someone had entered one of the RouteHawk prototype folders at 8:43 p.m. during the cookout. During the exact 23 minutes, Ryan had wandered into the garage holding a beer. Scott stared at the timestamp without moving. Outside wind brushed lightly against the siding of the house. Upstairs water pipes creaked softly. He clicked deeper into the logs. Several files had been opened, not copied, not yet, but studied. Scott leaned back slowly in his chair. Then he noticed something else. A printed email partially sticking out beneath a stack of shipping invoices on the desk beside him. He picked it up. The message had been deleted digitally days earlier, but Vanessa must have printed it accidentally. The sender line read, "Ryan Mercer." One sentence near the middle caught Scott's eye immediately. "If the software actually works the way you described, someone could monetize this fast." Scott read the line twice, then very carefully folded the paper in half. The garage smelled like cold dust, overheated plastic, and burnt coffee grounds. Scott Foster spent more time there than anywhere else in his life. By the 5th year of building RouteHawk, the space no longer resembled a normal suburban garage in Novi. The left wall was covered with freight maps pinned beside handwritten notes and color-coded shipping timelines. 2 folding tables held aging Dell monitors stacked beside external hard drives labeled by month and year. Ethernet cables ran across exposed beams overhead like tangled vines. The concrete floor remained unfinished. Vanessa hated that. You know, normal people park cars in garages, she said one Saturday morning while standing at the doorway in workout clothes worth half a paycheck. Scott sat in front of 3 screens, eyes fixed on a scrolling data set from a freight carrier in Indiana. "Morning," he said quietly. Vanessa ignored the greeting. "My parents are visiting next weekend." Scott nodded once. "You cannot have this place looking like a serial killer lives here." He looked around automatically. Whiteboards, code diagrams, shipment routes, coffee cups. There was nothing violent about any of it, just obsession. But obsession always looked dangerous to people who didn't understand it. Vanessa folded her arms. "You've spent 6 years on this." 5.5. "That's your correction," Scott typed another line into the system. RouteHawk processed thousands of invoice relationships every minute. Tiny anomalies appeared and disappeared constantly. Most were harmless, some weren't. He clicked one flagged pattern open. 3 warehouse managers, 2 shell vendors, repeated invoice inflation across 14 months, hidden theft worth nearly $1.8 million. Scott highlighted the entries silently. Vanessa watched him for another few seconds before speaking again. "You know what Ryan said?" Scott kept his eyes on the screen. "He said smart people know when to move on." That name again. Ryan Mercer. Over the previous 8 months, Ryan had slowly become unavoidable. He appeared in conversations more frequently than weather forecasts. Vanessa quoted him constantly now. His opinions on business, his opinions on investing, his opinions on successful men. Ryan always seemed to know what real success looked like. Scott apparently did not. "He works with founders every day," Vanessa continued. "Actual founders." Scott finally looked at her. The sentence hung there between them longer than either expected. Vanessa realized it immediately. Too late. She sighed sharply. "That's not what I meant." Scott nodded once and turned back toward the monitors. That calmness irritated her more than yelling would have. "You never react," she snapped. "There's nothing to react to. That's exactly the problem." She walked away before he answered. A few moments later, the sliding door slammed shut hard enough to rattle one of the whiteboards. Scott sat still in the silence afterward. Then he reopened the fraud cluster and kept working. At 1:37 a.m., he finally stopped coding. Outside, snow drifted quietly across the driveway beneath orange streetlights. The entire neighborhood looked frozen and artificial at that hour. Perfect houses, perfect lawns buried under perfect snow. Scott rubbed his eyes and reached for his notebook. Every night he documented progress by hand, not because he enjoyed journaling, because records mattered, dates mattered, version history mattered. People lied constantly. Systems did not. He wrote carefully, pattern correlation stabilized after vendor layering adjustment. False positives reduced by 18.4%. Then he stopped. A faint sound echoed from upstairs. Footsteps. Scott closed the notebook automatically. A moment later, the garage door opened. Ryan Mercer stepped inside carrying a beer bottle. "Jesus," Ryan said with a laugh, "you really do live out here." Scott remained seated. "It's quieter." Ryan wandered deeper into the garage, slowly, eyes scanning everything. The monitors, the diagrams, the servers, the handwritten flowcharts taped beside the insulation. Ryan whistled softly. "This is serious." Scott said nothing. Ryan stopped near one of the screens displaying shipment anomaly clusters. "What exactly am I looking at? Freight inconsistencies." Ryan leaned closer, like theft sometimes. "And companies pay for this? Some do." Ryan nodded thoughtfully. Scott watched him carefully now. There was something unusual about Ryan's curiosity. It was too focused. Most people ask broad questions. Ryan kept narrowing inward. "How does it detect manipulation?" Ryan asked. "Behavioral learning." "Partially. You patent any of this? Not yet." Ryan smiled faintly. That's risky. The garage heater clicked loudly overhead. Scott noticed Ryan studying one of the open directories reflected in the monitor glass. Vanessa says you built everything yourself. I did. That's impressive. Ryan sounded sincere. That bothered Scott more than mockery would have. A minute later, Vanessa appeared at the doorway. There you are, she said to Ryan. Everyone's inside. Ryan pointed toward the monitors. You undersold this. Vanessa rolled her eyes immediately. Please don't encourage him. Ryan laughed lightly. No, seriously. This is more advanced than I expected. Scott noticed Vanessa watching Ryan instead of him, watching his approval. That mattered to her now, not the software itself, not the years behind it. Validation from someone who already looked successful. Ryan finished the beer and placed the bottle carefully beside a stack of hardware manuals. Well, he said casually, if you ever want real investors, I know people. Scott nodded politely. I'm fine. Ryan smiled again. That same smooth smile. Everybody says that before they need capital. Then both of them disappeared back into the house. Scott remained still for several seconds. The heater hummed softly overhead. Snow tapped against the garage windows. Finally, Scott stood and walked toward the server shelf near the back wall. He checked the activity monitor. At first, nothing looked unusual. Then he noticed it. A remote directory request. Timestamp 11:08 p.m. Exactly 3 minutes earlier. Scott frowned. He opened the system logs. Someone had attempted to access one of the prototype architecture folders remotely through the local network. Not successfully, but attempted. Scott stared at the screen. Ryan had been standing less than 6 feet from the workstation. He checked deeper. Another attempt. This one, targeting predictive mapping files. Scott's jaw tightened slightly for the first time all night. Not anger, recognition. He suddenly understood something important. Ryan Mercer did not think RouteHawk was a joke. That meant Vanessa probably didn't either anymore. The humiliation, the mocking, the dinner party comments, those had belonged to an earlier stage. Now came curiosity. Curiosity was more dangerous. Scott disconnected the garage server from the internet immediately. One cable, then another. The monitors flickered softly as network access disappeared. At 2:11 a.m., he carried 3 external hard drives into the basement and locked them inside an old gun safe inherited from his father. The next morning, he drove 40 minutes south to a small accounting office outside Ann Arbor. Noah Bennett opened the door, wearing reading glasses and a Detroit Tigers hoodie. You look terrible, Noah said. Morning to you, too. Scott placed a cardboard file box onto the desk. What's this backups? Noah stared at him. That serious Scott nodded once. Noah closed the office blinds before speaking again. You think somebody's trying to take it? Scott considered the question carefully. No, he said. Then after a pause, I think somebody just realized it might actually work. Noah leaned back slowly in his chair. Outside the office window, freezing rain drifted across the empty parking lot. What do you want me to do? Noah asked. Scott slid a sealed envelope across the desk. Document everything he said quietly. Noah looked down at the envelope. Inside were printed logs, timestamps, and access reports. Proof, the first layer of it. Chicago looked expensive in winter. The sidewalks along West Loop glistened under freezing rain, while black SUVs crawled past glowing restaurant windows, filled with people who wore watches worth more than Scott Foster's yearly bonus. Maple and ash sat in the middle of it all like a showroom for controlled excess. Low lighting, marble floors, waiters in fitted black jackets moving with rehearsed confidence. Scott already regretted coming. Vanessa walked 3 steps ahead of him through the entrance heels, clicking sharply against stone. She wore a fitted dark green dress, and the expression she always used around wealthy people, now slightly louder smile, slightly straighter posture, slightly different voice. The hostess recognized Ryan Mercer immediately. "Good evening, Mr. Mercer." Ryan grinned easily. "Table for 4. Scott noticed Vanessa smiling at that. Not the greeting itself, the recognition. Status mattered to her more every month. They were seated near the back, beneath hanging amber lights that reflected across polished wine glasses and silverware. A massive open-fire grill crackled near the center of the restaurant, while conversations blended into one steady wave of money and alcohol. Ryan ordered without opening the menu. "Japanese A5 tasting," he said, "and the Reserve Cabernet." The waiter nodded immediately. Vanessa looked impressed. Scott ordered water. Ryan leaned back in his chair. "So, Scott," he said casually, "how's the software empire?" Vanessa laughed before Scott answered. "Oh, God. Don't encourage him." Ryan smirked. "No, seriously, I'm curious." Scott folded his hands calmly beside the table. "Still building." "That's dedication," Ryan said. "Most people quit after a year." Vanessa took a sip of wine. "Scott doesn't quit things." "That's kind of the problem." The sentence landed softly but intentionally. Scott looked at the condensation sliding down his water glass. Around them, silverware clinked against plates. A couple near the bar laughed too loudly. Ryan tilted his head. "What exactly does it do again, freight fraud detection?" Ryan nodded slowly. "For logistics companies, mostly." "And how are you handling predictive modeling?" Vanessa rolled her eyes dramatically. "Here we go." Scott noticed Ryan barely reacting to her interruption. His attention stayed fixed forward, focused. "You running behavioral analysis," Ryan continued, "or pattern reconciliation?" Scott answered carefully now. "Both." Ryan smiled faintly. "That's not easy." Vanessa laughed again. "You're giving him way too much credit." Scott remained quiet. The steaks arrived moments later on heated plates that hissed softly against the table. Butter melted across the meat beneath restaurant lighting so warm it almost hid the tension sitting there with them. Ryan cut into his steak while speaking casually. "You know what the biggest issue is with founders?" Scott looked up. "They fall in love with products nobody wants." Vanessa nodded immediately. "Exactly." Ryan pointed his knife lightly. "I'm serious. Smart people confuse effort with market value all the time." Scott took a slow sip of water. "Sometimes markets are late." Ryan grinned. "Sure." But 6 years late, Vanessa nearly choked, laughing. Scott watched her carefully. Not with anger, with recognition. There was something different about mockery once it became repetitive. At first, ridicule tried to change someone. Later, it became justification. Vanessa no longer mocked RouteHawk because she thought it would fail. She mocked it because she needed Scott to fail. Otherwise, she had misjudged him completely. Ryan leaned back comfortably. "So let me ask you something honestly," he said. "If this thing is really valuable, why hasn't anybody bought it?" Scott answered immediately. "Because I never offered it." Ryan paused, a small pause, but real. Vanessa noticed it too. "So mysterious," she said sarcastically. Ryan smiled again, though slightly tighter now. "But you'd sell eventually, right? Maybe?" "For the right number." Scott shrugged once. "If the company fit." Ryan studied him for several seconds after that, too carefully. Then the conversation shifted toward Chicago real estate venture capital and a startup acquisition Ryan claimed to be consulting on. Vanessa became animated immediately. Scott mostly listened. He noticed details instead. Ryan checked his phone every few minutes without reading messages. Vanessa laughed harder whenever Ryan spoke. The waiter addressed Ryan first, every time he approached the table. And 3 separate times during dinner, Ryan subtly redirected conversation back toward RouteHawk. Not obvious enough for Vanessa to notice. Obvious enough for Scott. "What's your infrastructure look like?" Ryan asked casually during dessert. "Basic, cloud, or local hybrid. Any enterprise clients yet?" Scott looked directly at him now. Why, Ryan smiled smoothly. Professional curiosity. Vanessa waved her hand dismissively. He thinks everybody secretly runs billion-dollar companies. Scott said nothing. Ryan lifted his wine glass. You'd be surprised what's valuable these days. The reflection hit Scott first, not the phone itself. The reflection. Ryan's screen glimmered faintly against the curved bowl of Vanessa's wine glass, a red recording symbol. Scott's eyes moved slowly downward. Ryan's phone rested face up beside his plate. Microphone active. Recording. Scott felt something settle quietly inside him then. Not panic, not rage, confirmation. Ryan wasn't laughing at RouteHawk anymore. He was collecting it. Scott leaned back in his chair slightly. The restaurant suddenly felt warmer, smaller. He replayed months of conversations silently in his head. Technical questions, investor comments, Vanessa discussing finances openly, Ryan wandering through the garage alone. Too many coincidences. Ryan noticed Scott looking toward the phone. Without hesitation, he flipped it face down. Smooth, fast, but not fast enough. You okay? Vanessa asked. Scott looked at her. Fine. Ryan smiled lightly. So Scott, hypothetically speaking? There it was again, hypothetically. If someone offered serious money for your platform tomorrow, what would you even do? Scott held his gaze. Keep records. Ryan laughed once. What does that mean? It means people get careless when money appears. For the first time all evening, Ryan stopped smiling completely. Only for a second. Then the mask returned. Vanessa glanced between them, sensing tension without understanding it. The waiter arrived with the check folder. Ryan grabbed it immediately. My treat. Vanessa touched his arm gratefully. Scott watched both of them quietly. The entire evening suddenly made sense. This dinner had not been random. Ryan wanted proximity, information, assessment, and Vanessa had helped without realizing the scale of it. Or maybe she had realized. Scott honestly didn't know anymore. Outside, freezing rain lashed across the sidewalk when they exited the restaurant. Steam rose from sewer grates into the dark Chicago air, while traffic lights reflected red across wet pavement. Ryan pulled his coat tighter. You heading back tonight? Scott nodded. Early shift. Ryan laughed softly. Man, you really never stop working. Scott looked at him calmly. Neither do you. For a moment, neither man moved. Then Vanessa stepped between them. We should do this again, she said. Scott noticed Ryan watching him instead of answering her. Yeah, Ryan said finally, definitely. A valet brought the car around. Vanessa climbed inside first. Scott stood in the freezing rain a moment longer while Ryan adjusted his gloves beside the curb. You know, Ryan said casually, there's a lot of money moving into logistics tech right now. Scott said nothing. Ryan smiled faintly. Would be a shame if somebody bigger built your idea first. Then he walked away toward another waiting vehicle. Scott remained motionless beside the street. Cold rain soaked through the shoulders of his jacket. Traffic hissed past. Somewhere nearby, a siren echoed between buildings. Inside the car, Vanessa lowered the passenger window halfway. You coming or what? Scott looked once more toward the disappearing taillights of Ryan's black Range Rover. Then he climbed into the car, silently. Halfway back to Michigan, Vanessa finally spoke. You embarrassed me tonight. Scott kept his eyes on the interstate ahead. How? You were weird with Ryan. Scott tightened his grip slightly on the steering wheel. He recorded dinner. Vanessa scoffed immediately. Oh my God. He had his phone recording. You're paranoid. Scott said nothing. Vanessa stared out the passenger window. You know what your problem is? She muttered. You think everybody's after something because you've spent too long hiding in that garage. Scott drove another mile before answering quietly. No, he said. I think people show you exactly who they are if you stay quiet long enough. Vanessa turned toward him sharply, but Scott never looked away from the road. The divorce papers arrived on a Wednesday morning in a white envelope stamped by Oakland County Circuit Court. Scott Foster found them wedged between grocery coupons and a propane bill inside the mailbox at the end of the driveway. Snow covered the lawn in uneven gray piles. One of the Christmas wreaths Vanessa forgot to remove still hung crooked near the garage. Scott stood outside for nearly a minute, reading the first page, while freezing wind pushed against his jacket. Petitioner Vanessa Marie Foster. The language felt cold even for legal documents. Irretrievable breakdown of marriage, financial instability, emotional withdrawal, obsessive behavior surrounding speculative business activities. Scott folded the papers carefully and walked back inside the house. Vanessa was already gone. Her coffee cup sat in the sink beside a lipstick-stained wine glass from the night before. Nothing else? No note, no conversation, just paperwork. The silence almost made it cleaner. Almost. 3 days later, Scott sat inside a conference room overlooking downtown Ann Arbor while attorney Rebecca Hale flipped methodically through the filing. She wore dark navy instead of black. No visible jewelry except a silver watch. Her office looked less like a law firm and more like a surgical suite. Minimal decoration, perfect organization, nothing unnecessary. Rebecca finished reading page 6 and removed her glasses slowly. How long has your wife been involved with Ryan Mercer? Scott looked toward the window. I don't know if involved is the right word. Rebecca raised an eyebrow. Mr. Foster, I bill by the hour. Let's avoid optimism. Scott almost smiled. About a year. Rebecca nodded once. And your software company? Not really a company yet. Name RouteHawk. Rebecca wrote it down. Ownership structure. Sole member LLC. Any outside investors? Any signed licensing agreements? No. She flipped another page, then stopped. Interesting. Rebecca turned the document toward him and tapped one paragraph with her pen. Did you notice this? Scott leaned forward. Vanessa's filing described RouteHawk as a speculative personal hobby project with no established market value or meaningful revenue potential. Scott sat quietly. Rebecca studied him carefully. What she always called it, a hobby. Rebecca leaned back slowly. No, she said. This is better than that. Scott frowned slightly. Rebecca tapped the paragraph again. She officially called it worthless. Outside the office window, snow drifted across Liberty Street while traffic crawled beneath frozen stoplights. Scott looked back down at the document. Meaningless words to most people. Potentially devastating words later. Rebecca continued reading. She's asking for the Novi House 50% of retirement assets and spousal support adjustments based on future earning potential. Scott nodded. That's expected, but here's what matters. Rebecca closed the file carefully. She excluded RouteHawk from meaningful valuation consideration. Scott remained silent. Rebecca's eyes sharpened slightly. Mr. Foster, how valuable do you believe this software could become? Scott thought for several seconds before answering. I think it solves a very expensive problem. That's not what I asked. Another pause. Then quietly, a lot. Rebecca leaned back in her chair fully now. For the first time since the meeting began, she seemed personally interested. Does Ryan Mercer understand that Scott met her eyes? I think he recently started to. Rebecca nodded once. Then from this moment forward, you document everything. She opened a yellow legal pad. Every development log, every server backup, every email, every timestamp, every visitor to your garage, every conversation involving the software. Scott listened carefully. No emotional text, Rebecca continued. No accusations, no threats, no social media responses. You stay boring. Scott blinked once. Boring. The legal system rewards calm people with records. Rebecca folded her hands. It punishes emotional people with opinions. Scott absorbed the sentence quietly. Rebecca pointed toward the divorce filing again. She just made an important decision. What decision she chose short-term advantage over long-term caution? Scott looked down at the papers. She thinks the software is worthless. Rebecca gave a small nod. Or she needs it to be. The negotiations dragged for 4 months. Vanessa pushed aggressively. She wanted the house entirely. She wanted larger monthly support. She wanted portions of Scott's retirement account and future investment income. But every time RouteHawk surfaced during financial review, Vanessa's attorney minimized it immediately. No current market viability, no proven profitability, personal side project. Ryan Mercer's language echoed through nearly every argument without ever appearing directly. Scott noticed. Rebecca definitely noticed. One afternoon during mediation inside a sterile office building outside Pontiac, Vanessa finally addressed RouteHawk directly across the table. "Why are we even wasting time discussing it?" she said impatiently. "It's not a real company." Scott looked at her quietly. She wore a cream wool coat and expensive gold earrings Ryan had probably bought her. Her tone carried irritation more than cruelty now. That somehow felt worse. Rebecca remained calm. For clarification, she said evenly, "You are affirming that you assign no substantial present or future financial value to RouteHawk LLC." Vanessa sighed dramatically. "Yes, and you are comfortable waiving future ownership interest in exchange for adjusted property distribution." "Today, yes." Rebecca nodded and wrote something down. Scott watched the pen move across the page. A small sound, ink against paper. Nothing dramatic, but he understood instinctively that moments like this mattered more than arguments ever did. Later that evening, Rebecca walked with Scott through the parking garage beneath the mediation office. Concrete echoed around them. "You're giving up a lot," she said. Scott stared toward his old Honda parked beneath fluorescent lights. "I know. The revised settlement heavily favored Vanessa financially. She would keep most of the house equity, larger liquid assets, additional retirement distribution. Scott accepted nearly all of it, because one line remained untouched: full sole ownership of RouteHawk and all intellectual property rights. Rebecca stopped beside his car. "You understand why I advise this?" Scott nodded once. "She wants certainty now, and she doesn't think RouteHawk matters." Rebecca looked directly at him. "People mock things right before they try to own them." The sentence stayed with him. 2 weeks later, the divorce finalized. No courtroom drama, no screaming, no emotional collapse, just signatures, electronic filings, quiet endings. Scott moved into a small one-bedroom apartment outside Dearborn with stained carpeting and unreliable heating. The building overlooked a highway exit ramp and a closed diner with boarded windows. Vanessa kept the house. Scott kept RouteHawk. That first night alone, he sat cross-legged on the apartment floor eating Chinese takeout beside unopened boxes of computer equipment. The silence felt different now, not tense, empty. He opened his laptop around midnight. New system logs filled the screen, fraud clusters, shipping anomalies, pattern drift, work waiting patiently for him to continue. Scott coded until nearly 3 in the morning. At 3:11 a.m., he finally stopped and leaned back against the wall. Outside, snowplows scraped along the highway. His phone buzzed once beside him. Unknown number. Scott hesitated before answering. "Hello?" A familiar voice responded immediately. "Ryan Mercer." "Hey, Scott." Scott said nothing. Ryan sounded relaxed, confident. "I heard the divorce finalized." Another silence. Then Ryan continued. "Tough situation. What do you want?" Ryan laughed softly. "Straight to business." "I respect that." Scott's eyes narrowed slightly. "I'm tired." "Well, maybe this'll wake you up." Ryan paused. "I've been thinking seriously about logistics tech lately." Scott remained perfectly still. "I think there's huge potential there." The apartment heater rattled loudly behind him. Ryan's voice lowered slightly. "If you ever decide you can't scale RouteHawk alone, give me a call." Scott stared at the dark window across the room. "You seem very interested in my software." Ryan laughed again. Interested in opportunity. Scott spoke carefully now. Opportunity for who? A brief silence answered him. Then Ryan said casually, "Don't take too long figuring that out." The line disconnected. Scott lowered the phone slowly. Then he opened a new folder on his desktop. Inside it, he created a document titled Mercer Timeline. Scott Foster first saw the Fleet Shield AI logo on a Tuesday night while eating microwaved soup alone in his apartment. Blue lettering, modern font, minimalist hawk icon tilted at almost the exact same angle as RouteHawk's original prototype symbol from 3 years earlier. Scott stared at the laptop screen without blinking. A startup article from Crane's Chicago Business filled the page. Logistics consultant Ryan Mercer launches Fleet Shield AI, a next-generation freight intelligence platform targeting supply chain fraud. Scott scrolled lower. The language tightened something cold inside his chest. Predictive anomaly detection. Behavioral invoice tracking. Vendor pattern intelligence. Different wording. Same architecture. The article included 3 photographs from the launch event inside a downtown Chicago co-working space with exposed brick walls and hanging Edison bulbs. Ryan stood beside investors wearing a dark tailored suit and the same relaxed smile he carried into every room. Vanessa stood beside him in one image holding a champagne glass. Her hand rested lightly against Ryan's arm. Scott kept reading. Fleet Shield AI claimed to detect freight fraud before losses occurred. That line bothered him most because it mirrored wording from one of Scott's early internal development summaries, almost exactly. He opened another browser window immediately, then another, then another. For the next 4 hours, Scott compared screenshots from the article against archived RouteHawk documentation stored on his external drives. Workflow diagrams, flagging hierarchy, risk severity scaling. Even the color structure looked familiar. Not copied directly, translated, cleaned, commercialized. At 2:43 a.m., Scott leaned back slowly in his chair. The apartment remained silent, except for highway noise filtering faintly through the walls. Most people would have reacted emotionally. Scott started organizing folders. By sunrise, he had created 6 separate evidence directories: timeline, visual comparisons, access logs, metadata, Mercer contact history, ELA potential exposure events. He worked another full warehouse shift afterward without mentioning any of it. The following Friday, Noah Bennett visited the apartment carrying takeout containers and a banker's box filled with printed tax filings. Noah stepped inside and looked around. "You still living like a college freshman?" Scott closed his laptop. "It's temporary." Noah placed the food on the counter. "You look worse. Busy week." Noah noticed the open folders immediately. The screenshots, the highlighted comparisons, the printed Fleet Shield marketing pages. His expression changed. "Oh." Scott nodded once. Noah sat down slowly across from him. That bad, Scott slid a comparison sheet forward. On the left sat an archived RouteHawk process hierarchy dated almost 2 years earlier. On the right sat Fleet Shield's investor presentation. The structures matched almost perfectly. Noah stared quietly. "Jesus." Scott rubbed his eyes. They changed terminology, reorganized some interface design, but the underlying logic is mine. Noah looked back toward the article photo. "Can you prove it?" Scott opened another folder. Server logs appeared across the screen. Dates, remote access attempts, file activity timestamps, garage entry records, email metadata. Scott had documented everything. Noah leaned back slowly. "You knew this might happen." Scott considered the question. "No," he said quietly. "I knew people get interested once they smell money." Noah stared at him for several seconds. "You calling Rebecca?" Scott nodded. "Already sent copies." 3 days later, Scott drove to Chicago, not to confront Ryan, to observe him. The Fleet Shield Investor Showcase occupied the upper floor of a polished co-working tower overlooking the Chicago River. Young employees in fitted quarter zips moved between glass conference rooms carrying tablets and branded coffee cups. Everything looked expensive in the temporary way startups often did. Least confidence? Scott signed in under his real name. Nobody recognized him. He wore dark jeans work boots and an old charcoal jacket beside rooms full of polished founders, performing certainty for investors. Perfect camouflage. A presentation began at noon. Scott sat quietly in the back row beneath dimmed lights, while Ryan stepped onto stage beside a massive digital Fleet Shield logo. Ryan looked comfortable there. That irritated Scott more than arrogance would have, because Ryan genuinely believed he belonged. Supply chain fraud costs American logistics companies over $50 billion annually, Ryan said confidently. Slides illuminated behind him, graphs, risk models, detection structures. Scott watched carefully. Every few minutes, another familiar framework appeared beneath different branding. A rerouted version of RouteHawk's core thinking. Not enough for a simple lawsuit, enough for something else. A pattern. Ryan clicked to another slide. Our predictive escalation architecture prioritizes layered anomaly behavior. Scott's eyes narrowed slightly. Layered anomaly behavior. Exact phrase. Directly lifted from a development notebook Scott wrote 18 months earlier. Not public, never published. Noah, Rebecca, and Scott were the only people who had seen it, unless someone else had. Scott quietly took photographs of every slide. Time-stamped. Documented. No emotional reaction crossed his face. Around him, investors nodded approvingly. Questions followed afterward. Scalability, government applications, defense logistics potential. Ryan answered smoothly. Scott listened carefully to what Ryan avoided answering. No technical depth, no engineering specifics, broad concepts only, because Ryan understood monetization, not construction. After the presentation ended, people gathered around expensive coffee stations while conversations echoed across polished concrete floors. Scott remained near the back wall unnoticed. Then Vanessa saw him. Her expression froze instantly. Scott, nearby conversation, softened slightly. Ryan turned. For one brief second, surprise cracked through his polished composure. Then it disappeared. Didn't expect to see you here, Ryan said smoothly. Scott looked around the room. Nice presentation. Vanessa folded her arms immediately. You can't just show up like this. Scott ignored her. He looked directly at Ryan. You've been busy. Ryan smiled. That's how startups work. Scott nodded once. A nearby investor glanced curiously between them. Ryan noticed it too. His tone sharpened slightly beneath the charm. You here to accuse me of something? Scott remained calm. No, Vanessa scoffed. Then what's the point? Scott finally looked at her. I wanted to see how much of it you understood. The sentence landed harder than volume would have. Ryan's smile thinned almost invisibly. Vanessa flushed immediately. You're unbelievable. Scott reached into his jacket pocket slowly. For a moment, Ryan stiffened. But Scott only removed a business card, Rebecca Hale's office information. He placed it gently on the cocktail table between them. If Fleet Shield continues using RouteHawk architecture, Scott said quietly, future communication goes through her. Vanessa laughed sharply. Oh my God. Ryan didn't laugh. Neither did Scott. The room suddenly felt smaller around them. Investors nearby pretended not to listen. Ryan folded his hands calmly. That's a serious accusation. Scott nodded. It is? Ryan leaned slightly closer. You think because you built software in a garage that nobody else could arrive at similar ideas? Scott answered immediately. No. A pause. I think you accessed my systems. Vanessa stepped forward instantly. This is insane. Scott still never raised his voice. timestamp during the Novi cookout, prototype folder access, network requests, shared terminology appearing later in your architecture. Ryan stared at him carefully now. No smile left. Can you prove that? Scott met his eyes. Eventually. Silence settled between them. Ryan recovered first. That sounds expensive. Scott nodded once again. It probably will be. Then he turned and walked away. Not dramatic, no threats, no shouting, just departure. That unsettled Ryan far more. Outside, freezing wind swept through downtown Chicago, while traffic reflected silver against wet streets. Scott crossed the sidewalk toward the parking garage without looking back. His phone buzzed halfway there. Rebecca Hale. Scott answered immediately. Well, she asked. He used my terminology. Expected. He's pitching investors. Rebecca sounded unsurprised. Good. Scott frowned slightly while stepping into the elevator. Good. The louder people get, Rebecca said calmly, the more evidence they create. The elevator doors closed softly. Scott looked down at the photograph still glowing across his phone screen. Fleet Shield AI. Clean branding. Polished lies. Public exposure. Every slide. Every phrase. Every timestamp. Evidence. When Scott reached his car, snow had begun falling lightly across the windshield. He sat behind the steering wheel for several moments before starting the engine. Then he opened a padded manila envelope resting on the passenger seat. Inside sat printed logs, screenshots, access reports, and archived development records, carefully organized, carefully dated. Scott sealed the envelope again. Tomorrow morning, Rebecca Hale would receive the original copies by certified mail. Nobody at Great Lakes Freight Systems expected much from Scott Foster. That became obvious within the first 3 minutes of the meeting. The company headquarters sat outside Toledo in a low-brick building squeezed between a truck maintenance yard and a diesel fueling station. Snowmelt dripped from rusted gutters while freight trailers rattled across potholes in the parking lot. Inside the conference room, 3 executives waited around a scratched laminate table drinking burnt coffee from foam cups. Scott arrived carrying a faded black laptop backpack and wearing the same gray work jacket he used at Mid-States Freight Distribution. No tailored suit, no startup branding, no polished sales team, just Scott. The operations director, Marty Givens, glanced toward him once and visibly recalculated his expectations downward. Your Foster. Scott nodded. Marty. They shook hands. Marty's grip carried skepticism more than confidence. Beside him sat company CFO Denise Rollins and logistics supervisor Eric Vaughn, both wearing expressions Scott recognized immediately. They expected disappointment. That was fine. Scott preferred low expectations. Marty opened the meeting bluntly. Look, I'll be honest. We already sat through presentations from 3 AI companies this quarter. Scott placed his laptop on the table calmly. Okay. They all promised predictive fraud detection. Scott nodded once. Okay. None of them found anything useful. Scott plugged in the laptop charger. That usually means they searched for obvious theft. Denise leaned forward slightly. What does that mean? Scott opened RouteHawk. Dark interface, minimal graphics, no flashy animations, just structured data. Most fraud isn't dramatic, Scott said quietly. It survives because it stays boring. The room went silent for a moment. Scott continued. People look for giant theft events. Real losses usually come from tiny manipulations repeated thousands of times. Eric crossed his arms. So what exactly does your software do differently? Scott typed several commands. RouteHawk loaded 6 months of company logistics data Great Lakes had provided earlier that week, invoices, fuel records, route timing, vendor activity, driver logs. Thousands of lines moved across the screen. Scott enlarged one section. This vendor, he said. Denise frowned. Parker Industrial Fuel. Scott nodded. Your system pays them through 3 different routing codes. Marty shrugged. That's normal. Not with these timing overlaps. Scott highlighted several transactions. Same truck IDs. Same delivery windows. Slightly altered invoice structures. Denise leaned closer now. Scott kept going. Fuel usage reports also spike every 17 days regardless of route distance. Eric frowned harder. That could just be reporting error. Scott opened another screen. No, he said calmly. Reporting errors don't correlate with payroll overtime inflation. Silence. Marty sat forward slowly. Scott clicked one final window open. A behavioral cluster map appeared. 5 employee accounts connected through layered authorization approvals. Scott pointed quietly. Your fraud problem is internal. Nobody spoke. Outside the conference room window, a freight trailer backed toward the loading dock with a long, hydraulic hiss. Denise stared at the screen. How much money? Scott zoomed further in. Estimated losses over 14 months. He paused briefly. Around $2.3 million. Eric looked pale suddenly. That's impossible. Scott shook his head once. No, it's repetitive. Marty looked toward Denise. Denise looked toward Eric. Nobody seemed certain where to focus first. That was when Scott knew RouteHawk finally worked in the real world. Not theory, not prototypes. Reality. 2 weeks later, Great Lakes suspended 4 employees quietly. One resigned immediately. Another attempted deleting accounting records before security stopped him. By the end of the month, internal investigators confirmed nearly everything RouteHawk flagged. The losses exceeded Scott's estimate by another $600,000. After that, people returned his calls much faster. The pilot contract expanded immediately. Scott still worked warehouse shifts during the day, still drove the same Honda, still lived in the same small apartment near Dearborn. But nights changed. Now he spent them debugging live enterprise systems instead of isolated prototypes. At 11:40 p.m., most evenings RouteHawk processed thousands of active freight records, while Scott sat cross-legged at his kitchen table, eating vending machine dinners beside glowing monitors. His exhaustion became physical. Dark circles beneath his eyes, coffee shaking slightly in his hand. 3 hours of sleep some nights. But there was movement now, momentum. One Friday evening, Noah Bennett visited again, carrying 2 paper bags from a barbecue place down the street. Scott barely noticed him enter. You alive? Scott kept typing. Probably. Noah set food beside the keyboard. You missed lunch again. Scott glanced toward the clock. It was almost 9 at night. Guess so. Noah looked around the apartment. Hard drives stacked beside the couch. Shipping reports covering the table. Takeout containers in the sink. You know normal millionaires eventually hire staff. Scott finally looked up. I'm not a millionaire. Noah laughed once. No, but for the first time that sounds temporary. Scott leaned back slowly. His phone buzzed against the table. Unknown number from Washington, D.C. He answered carefully. Scott Foster, a woman's voice responded. This is Angela Ruiz with Federal Freight Oversight. Scott straightened slightly. We reviewed Great Lakes' internal audit findings. Scott remained quiet. Angela continued. They mentioned RouteHawk specifically. Noah stopped eating immediately. We're interested in a confidential demonstration. Scott looked toward the dark apartment window. What kind of demonstration? A logistics security review. Scott understood the careful wording. Government agencies rarely said exactly what they meant on first calls. When next month? Washington. After the call ended, Noah stared at him. Well, Scott rubbed his eyes slowly. Federal review. Noah let out a low whistle. That's real. Scott nodded once. Neither man celebrated. Not yet. Because success at that level attracted attention, and attention changed people. 3 nights later, Scott learned exactly how fast news traveled. He stopped at a hotel bar near downtown Detroit after leaving the warehouse late, mostly empty place, hockey game playing silently above rows of liquor bottles. Scott ordered coffee. At the far end of the bar, two consultants in expensive coats discussed logistics software acquisitions loudly enough for half the room to hear. One sentence caught Scott immediately. Fleet Shield's getting nervous. Scott stayed still. The second man laughed. Because of that Detroit guy. Apparently his software actually works. Scott lowered his eyes toward the coffee cup. The conversation continued. Ryan Mercer thought Foster was some hobby coder. Not anymore. What's the issue? Pilot results leaked. Investors are asking questions. Scott listened without reacting. The first consultant took another drink. Mercer's scrambling to lock down clients before RouteHawk spreads. Scott finished the coffee slowly. Outside snow drifted across Woodward Avenue beneath orange streetlights. For the first time in years, Scott sensed fear moving in the opposite direction. Not his fear, Ryan's. The next morning, Vanessa texted him for the first time in almost 2 months. He stared at the message without opening it fully. He could already read part of it from the notification preview. Heard your software landed some contracts. Scott set the phone face down on the table. An hour later, another message arrived. Ryan says, "Congratulations. That's genuinely impressive." Scott almost smiled at that. Ryan says. Not Vanessa says. Ryan monitored RouteHawk now, constantly. That mattered. Scott returned to work. At 6:18 p.m. that evening, another email arrived. Confidential meeting request. Sender Northstar Sentinel Technologies. Scott opened it slowly. Northstar specialized in defense logistics infrastructure, massive contracts, federal systems, billions in transportation oversight. The message was brief. We have reviewed preliminary information regarding RouteHawk's anomaly detection architecture. We would like to discuss potential strategic alignment opportunities. Noah called 20 minutes later after Scott forwarded the email. Strategic alignment, Noah repeated. That's corporate language for acquisition. Scott stared quietly at the warehouse loading docks outside his office window. Forklifts moved through freezing air while trailer lights glowed red against the snow. Maybe, or maybe scrutiny. At that level, both often arrived together. Another message buzzed onto Scott's phone, this time from Ryan Mercer directly. Heard you've been busy. Scott read it once, then deleted nothing, archived everything. The cease and desist letter arrived by FedEx at 9:14 on a Monday morning. Scott Foster signed for it, while standing beside Warehouse Bay 4 at Mid-States Freight Distribution. Diesel fumes drifted through the loading docks, while forklifts screamed across concrete behind him. The envelope carried the logo of a Chicago corporate law firm, printed in dark silver lettering. Expensive paper, expensive threat. Scott opened it inside the small operations office overlooking the freight floor. The letter accused RouteHawk of unauthorized use of proprietary Fleet Shield AI methodologies, theft of protected analytical frameworks, potential corporate espionage. Scott read the entire document twice without expression. Then he placed it flat on the desk beside his coffee. A younger dispatcher named Tyler glanced over nervously. "You okay?" Scott nodded once. "Fine." Tyler looked unconvinced. That looked serious. Scott folded the letter carefully. People usually get louder when they're nervous. At noon, he scanned every page directly to Rebecca Hale. By 12:23 p.m., she called. "They filed first," Rebecca said calmly. Scott leaned back in the office chair. That bad number paper shuffled softly on her end. Predictable. They're accusing me of stealing their system. Rebecca almost sounded amused. They're trying to establish narrative positioning before due diligence begins. Scott stared through the office window at rows of freight trailers backing into docks. So what happens now? We answer professionally. Then we keep building. Scott remained quiet. Rebecca's voice sharpened slightly. Scott listened carefully. Emotional people think lawsuits are about truth. They're actually about documentation. Scott nodded to himself. We have the records. We have better than records, Rebecca corrected. We have chronology. That mattered more, because chronology could not be improvised later. That evening, Scott drove home through freezing rain while Detroit radio stations warned about black ice along E94. His apartment parking lot sat nearly empty except for an old pickup truck, missing its rear bumper. Inside, his phone buzzed again before he removed his jacket. Vanessa. 3 unread messages. Scott opened the first. You seriously have lawyers involved now. Second message, Ryan says you're making a huge mistake. Third, after everything I did for you, this is unbelievable. Scott stared at the screen quietly. After everything I did for you. Interesting sentence. Not after everything we built. Not after everything you sacrificed. Did for you? Scott typed nothing back. Instead, he screenshotted the messages and archived them into the Mercer timeline folder. At 11:40 p.m., another message appeared. This one directly from Ryan. You're turning business competition into paranoia. Scott read the line once. Then another message followed immediately. You really think a federal contractor would touch your software if this becomes public? That one mattered. Scott leaned forward slowly, because Ryan should not have known about the federal logistics demo. Very few people did. Scott opened another folder. New contacts. He added the message. Time-stamped, documented. Then he called Rebecca. Interesting, she asked immediately after hearing the details. He knows about Washington. Silence briefly filled the line. That narrows information exposure significantly, Rebecca said calmly. Scott stared toward the apartment window. Snow moved sideways, beneath the parking lot lights outside. You think someone leaked it? I think Ryan Mercer is panicking. Scott rubbed his forehead. What do we do? Rebecca answered immediately. Nothing emotional. That phrase again, nothing emotional. She continued. People like Mercer expect reaction. Reaction creates mistakes. Calm creates evidence. The next week became brutal. Scott barely slept. Warehouse shifts during the day, RouteHawk updates through the night, legal calls squeezed between both. Northstar Sentinel Technologies requested additional architecture reviews and proprietary documentation under strict confidentiality agreements. That alone told Scott how serious things were becoming. Major corporations did not spend weeks investigating software they considered insignificant. Still, Scott avoided telling anyone at Mid-States. He kept loading freight schedules, fixing inventory routing errors, and eating vending machine dinners in the operations office after midnight. Ordinary routine became camouflage. On Thursday evening, Noah Bennett visited again carrying printed financial statements. The apartment looked worse now. Whiteboards leaned against walls. Hard drives covered half the kitchen counter. Scott hadn't shaved properly in days. Noah looked around slowly. You planning to become a human being again any time soon? Scott kept typing. Unclear. Noah sat across from him. Rebecca called. Scott finally looked up. And she thinks Northstar's serious. Scott remained still. Northstar represented an entirely different world from Great Lakes freight systems, defense logistics, federal infrastructure, multi-billion-dollar acquisition capacity, the kind of companies ordinary people never interacted with directly. Noah lowered his voice slightly. How serious? Scott opened an email chain. Northstar had requested source code audits, infrastructure review, intellectual property verification, ownership chronology, developer access history. Noah stared at the screen. That's acquisition-level due diligence. Scott leaned back slowly. Maybe. Noah laughed once. You really still talk like this is hypothetical? Scott didn't answer, because part of him still expected everything to collapse. 6 years of ridicule trained caution into him permanently. The next morning, Another problem arrived. A black SUV waited outside Mid-States when Scott finished his shift. Ryan Mercer leaned against the passenger door, wearing a charcoal overcoat and leather gloves. Warehouse workers noticed immediately. Ryan did not belong there. Too polished. Too expensive. Scott stopped beside the curb. Ryan smiled lightly. "You don't answer texts." Scott kept his hands in his jacket pockets. "What do you want?" Ryan glanced toward the warehouse building. "Privacy." "You picked the wrong location." Ryan ignored the comment. "Look, this is getting out of hand." Scott said nothing. Ryan stepped closer. Lawyers, accusations, documentation. He shook his head slightly. "You're making yourself look unstable." Scott watched him carefully. Ryan always relied on tone instead of specifics. "Control the emotional framing first?" Classic tactic. "You accessed my systems," Scott said calmly. Ryan smiled faintly. "You can't prove that." "Not yet." Ryan's jaw tightened almost invisibly. Snow drifted lightly across the parking lot while diesel engines rumbled nearby. Ryan lowered his voice. "You know what your problem is." Scott waited. "You spent too long thinking intelligence matters more than leverage." Scott looked toward the freight yard behind them. Forklifts moved between trailers beneath gray Michigan skies. Then he answered quietly, "No, I think leverage expires once records exist." Ryan studied him for several seconds. No smile now, only calculation. Finally, Ryan exhaled sharply. "You really believe Northstar's going to buy your little software company?" Scott met his eyes evenly. "I think they're interested." Ryan laughed once, short, tight. Interested companies don't mean acquisition. Scott nodded slightly. "That's true." Ryan relaxed a little. Then Scott continued, "But terrified competitors usually mean value." The sentence landed cleanly. Ryan's expression hardened instantly. For a moment, Scott saw something real underneath the polished confidence. Fear. Not fear of Scott personally. Fear of losing position, losing narrative, losing investors. Ryan stepped closer one final time. "If you push this publicly, things get ugly." Scott answered immediately, "You already made them ugly." Then he walked past him toward the parking lot exit. Ryan did not follow. That evening, Scott boarded a flight to Washington, D.C. Northstar had requested an in-person review at their headquarters in Arlington, Virginia. Scott wore the only suit he owned, dark gray, slightly outdated, still carrying warehouse dust along one sleeve despite repeated brushing. He sat alone near the back of the plane reviewing RouteHawk documentation, while turbulence rattled overhead. Most passengers slept. Scott couldn't. At 1:12 a.m., the aircraft descended toward Reagan National Airport, beneath sheets of freezing rain. The next morning, a black sedan picked him up outside the hotel. No logos, no unnecessary conversation. The driver crossed the Potomac while Washington's gray skyline emerged through fog and winter drizzle. Then Scott saw it. Northstar Sentinel Technologies headquarters. Glass, steel, security barriers, the kind of building designed to look permanent. Scott stepped from the car, carrying the same old laptop backpack he'd used for years. A security badge was waiting for him at reception. Temporary visitor authorization, Foster Scott. As he clipped it onto his jacket, his phone buzzed once. Another message from Ryan Mercer. "Last chance to handle this privately." Scott looked at the message. Then at the towering Northstar building reflected across the polished lobby floor. Finally, he locked the phone screen and slid it back into his pocket. A woman in a navy suit approached him. "Mr. Foster?" she asked. Scott nodded. "I'm Claire Donovan, Northstar Acquisitions Division." She extended her hand. "Let's talk about RouteHawk." Northstar Sentinel Technologies did not resemble the startup world Ryan Mercer performed inside. No exposed brick, no neon slogans, no 25-year-olds calling themselves visionaries beside ping-pong tables. Northstar felt surgical, controlled. Every hallway inside the Arlington headquarters carried the quiet precision of a place handling government contracts worth more than small countries' yearly budgets. Scott Foster noticed that immediately. Security doors opened only after multiple badge scans. Conference rooms contained no unnecessary decoration. Even the coffee tasted expensive in a restrained way. Claire Donovan led him through 3 separate authorization checkpoints before stopping outside a glass-walled meeting room overlooking the Potomac River. "Before we begin," she said calmly, "everything discussed today remains confidential under signed review terms." Scott nodded once. Inside waited 6 people: acquisitions attorneys, infrastructure analysts, cybersecurity auditors. Not one of them smiled casually. Scott preferred that. The meeting began at 8:03 a.m. For the next 4 hours, Northstar dismantled RouteHawk, piece by piece. Not critically, methodically. Walk us through original architecture development. Explain your anomaly prioritization logic. Who had access to core infrastructure? When were predictive mapping systems introduced? Why was hybrid local storage maintained? Scott answered everything carefully. No exaggeration, no founder theatrics, just chronology, dates, systems, records. That became his advantage quickly. Most tech founders sold excitement. Scott sold documentation. By noon, Northstar's lead cybersecurity auditor, a gray-haired former NSA analyst named Victor Lang, leaned back in his chair and removed his glasses slowly. "You documented all version progression manually." Scott nodded. "And digitally." Victor glanced toward another analyst reviewing server histories. "That's unusual." Scott shrugged slightly. "Warehouses lose things." A few people almost smiled at that. Almost. Claire Donovan folded her hands. "Mr. Foster, let's address Fleet Shield AI directly." The room quieted slightly. Scott expected this. Claire continued. Ryan Mercer's attorneys submitted concerns regarding overlapping logistics methodologies. Scott remained calm. "We anticipated that." Claire slid a document across the table. Northstar requires absolute clarity regarding ownership exposure before acquisition consideration proceeds further. Acquisition consideration, not exploratory interest anymore. Closer now. Scott opened the folder. Inside sat printed summaries of Fleet Shield's allegations, claims of conceptual overlap, claims of stolen methodology, claims of market confusion, weak legally, dangerous commercially. Scott closed the folder carefully. "May I show you something?" he asked. Claire nodded. Scott connected an external hard drive to the conference system. Then he opened the first archived RouteHawk notebook scan, dated 4 years earlier. Layered anomaly behavior. Next came prototype interface captures, then time-stamped source code commits, then garage access logs, then metadata chains, then the restaurant recording timeline, then remote access attempts linked to Ryan's visit. The room grew progressively quieter. Nobody interrupted anymore. Victor Lang leaned closer toward the screen. "When exactly did Fleet Shield launch publicly?" Scott answered immediately. 18 months after initial unauthorized access attempts. Another analyst spoke for the first time. "You retained all server histories?" "Yes." "All backups?" "Yes." Claire Donovan studied Scott carefully now. Why Scott considered the question honestly. Because people change when money gets close. Silence settled briefly. Victor looked toward the chronology documents again. "Your ex-wife officially declared RouteHawk worthless during divorce proceedings." Scott nodded once. Another folder appeared on screen. Divorce valuation filings, signed statements, legal disclosures, Vanessa's own words, no meaningful value, speculative hobby project, no future profitability expectation. Northstar's legal team exchanged glances immediately. That mattered enormously, not emotionally, legally. Claire tapped one page lightly. She waived future ownership claims, yes. Victor let out a slow breath. That's clean. For the first time all day, Scott felt tension loosen slightly beneath his ribs. Not safety, just movement. Northstar paused the meeting briefly around 1:40 p.m. Claire escorted Scott toward a private lounge overlooking the river, while analysts remained behind reviewing materials. You've been preparing for this for a long time, she observed. Scott accepted black coffee from a catering tray. I prepared for problems. Claire studied him quietly. Most people in your position would have confronted Mercer publicly months ago. Scott looked through the glass toward Washington's gray winter skyline. That wouldn't help. Claire nodded once. No, it wouldn't. Her phone buzzed softly. She checked it briefly, then looked back at Scott. Fleet Shield contacted us again this morning. Scott's expression remained neutral. What did they say? They implied RouteHawk's ownership position may collapse under litigation pressure. Scott took a slow sip of coffee. Claire watched him carefully. You don't seem concerned. Scott answered honestly. I'm concerned about facts, not pressure. Something about that answer changed her posture slightly. Respect. Small. Professional. Real. The afternoon session became more aggressive. Northstar's attorneys challenged every weakness they could identify. Patent timing, licensing exposure, prior employer claims, potential marital property disputes, federal compliance risk. Scott answered each question patiently, not perfectly, but consistently. Consistency mattered more. Around 4:15 p.m., Victor Lang reopened the Fleet Shield comparison analysis. One thing still bothers me, he said. Scott waited. Victor enlarged two architecture structures side by side on screen. Mercer's people changed enough visual layering to avoid direct duplication claims. Scott nodded. That was intentional. Victor looked up sharply. You believe this was deliberate? Yes. Why? Scott answered immediately. Because Ryan understands optics better than engineering. The room went quiet again. Victor stared at him for several seconds before slowly nodding. That answer fit perfectly. At 5:02 p.m., the formal session finally ended. Claire gathered several folders while others filtered quietly from the room. We'll continue due diligence through next week, she said. Scott packed his laptop slowly. Then Claire added unofficially. Scott looked up. You're one of the most prepared founders we've reviewed in years. Founder. The word still sounded strange attached to him. Scott carried freight schedules for a living, fixed warehouse routing failures, ate gas station sandwiches beside forklifts. Founder belonged to people like Ryan, at least externally. Claire seemed to recognize the thought crossing his face. You know why companies fail due diligence? She asked. Scott shook his head slightly. Founders confuse charisma with evidence. That stayed with him. Back at the hotel that evening, Scott sat alone near the window, overlooking Arlington traffic while snow drifted across dark streets below. His laptop remained open across the desk. Dozens of unread emails waited. Northstar follow-ups, legal review requests, pilot expansion inquiries. Then another message arrived, from Vanessa. Scott stared at the preview without opening it fully. Ryan says Northstar contacted him too. Scott finally opened the message. You're dragging this too far. Nobody's trying to steal your life. A second message followed immediately. Ryan built Fleet Shield himself. Scott leaned back slowly in the chair. Not because the statement upset him, because it confirmed something important. Vanessa still genuinely didn't understand what Ryan had done, or maybe she understood and could no longer separate herself from it. Scott closed the messages and archived them. Then his phone rang. Rebecca Hale. Well, she asked immediately. Scott walked toward the window. Northstar still interested. That's not what I asked. Scott almost smiled faintly. They believe the chronology. Rebecca exhaled softly. Good. Scott watched headlights move below through falling snow. There's still risk. There's always risk. Rebecca paused. But risk changes once professionals start reviewing facts instead of stories. Scott nodded to himself. Then he told her about one final question Northstar asked near the end of the meeting. Claire Donovan's exact words still echoed clearly. Is there anything else we should know before this proceeds further? Rebecca became silent for several seconds after hearing that. Finally, she spoke carefully. That's not a casual question. Scott looked back toward the laptop screen, filled with evidence folders. I know. Rebecca lowered her voice slightly. If there's anything hidden, now is the time. Scott answered immediately. There isn't. But after the call ended, he remained standing by the hotel window much longer than necessary, because one thought refused to leave him. Ryan Mercer sounded desperate now. Desperate people rarely stopped at legal threats. The deposition room sat on the 23rd floor of a downtown Chicago law office overlooking Lake Michigan. Gray sky, gray water, gray carpet. Everything about the room felt intentionally neutral, as if emotion itself had been professionally removed from the architecture. Scott Foster preferred it immediately. Rebecca Hale sat beside him at the polished conference table, wearing the same controlled expression she carried into every legal meeting. 3 binders rested neatly aligned in front of her, beside a legal pad filled with small, precise handwriting. Across the table sat Ryan Mercer and Fleet Shield's attorneys. Vanessa arrived 15 minutes late. Scott noticed the tension before anyone spoke. Ryan's confidence had changed shape over the previous month. The polished charm remained visible, but strain now lived beneath it. His jaw tightened more often. His smile disappeared faster. Pressure was accumulating. Northstar's ongoing review had spread quietly through logistics investment circles. People understood what it meant when a defense contractor conducted deep acquisition due diligence, money, serious money. And now every timeline mattered. A court reporter adjusted her equipment near the wall while attorneys shuffled papers beneath fluorescent lighting. Rebecca never looked rushed. That alone unsettled people. Ryan's lead attorney, Martin Keene, opened first. Mr. Foster has accused our client of intellectual property overlap without direct proof of source code theft. Rebecca folded her hands calmly. Incorrect, she said. Martin paused. Rebecca slid one binder across the table. We alleged unauthorized access, developmental overlap, chronology, terminology, replication, and commercial misrepresentation based on documented timelines. Martin frowned slightly. Semantics. Rebecca looked directly at him. No, precision. Scott remained silent. That was the strategy. Rebecca handled legal pressure better than anger ever could. Ryan leaned back in his chair. So, what exactly do you think happened? He asked Scott directly. You think I broke into your system and stole software? Scott met his eyes evenly. I think you underestimated how carefully I kept records. Silence settled briefly. Vanessa crossed her arms. This is insane. Rebecca finally turned toward her. Mrs. Foster, during divorce proceedings, did you describe RouteHawk as a worthless, speculative hobby project? Vanessa blinked. What does that have to do with anything? Please answer. Vanessa shifted slightly in her seat. Yes? Rebecca opened another binder. You also signed documents waiving future ownership claims tied to RouteHawk LLC in exchange for increased immediate asset distribution. Vanessa's expression tightened. Yes, because at the time, thank you. Rebecca interrupted softly, not rude, controlled. Vanessa looked frustrated immediately. Scott watched quietly. That was another thing Rebecca understood better than most people. You did not need volume to dominate a room, only sequence. Rebecca turned toward Ryan next. Mr. Mercer, how many times did you visit the Foster residence before Fleet Shield AI launched publicly? Ryan shrugged lightly. I don't know. A few. Rebecca slid forward printed visitor timelines, 7 documented visits. Ryan glanced down briefly. Okay. During those visits, did you enter Mr. Foster's garage workspace? Probably. Probably, Ryan exhaled. Yes. Rebecca nodded once. Then she clicked a remote. A projection screen illuminated behind her. Server access logs appeared. Time-stamped, detailed, clean. Scott watched Ryan's posture change almost invisibly. Rebecca continued calmly. These access attempts occurred during your documented presence at the residence. Ryan shook his head immediately. That proves nothing. Rebecca clicked again. Another screen appeared. Development terminology comparisons. Layered anomaly behavior. Predictive escalation mapping. Behavioral invoice clustering. Exact phrase progression across RouteHawk documentation months before Fleet Shield launch. Ryan's attorney leaned forward sharply. Terminology overlap is not theft. No, Rebecca agreed calmly. But chronology combined with access history, recorded inquiries, investor positioning, and developmental replication becomes highly relevant during acquisition review. Acquisition review? She used the phrase intentionally. Ryan noticed. Scott noticed too. Martin Keene adjusted his tie. Is this about Northstar Sentinel Technologies? Rebecca didn't answer immediately. Instead, she turned another page. Mr. Mercer, did you or did you not record conversations regarding RouteHawk architecture during dinner meetings in Chicago? Ryan's expression hardened instantly. No. Rebecca clicked again. A photograph appeared on screen. Ryan's phone reflected clearly in a wine glass beside a visible recording icon. Vanessa looked stunned. Ryan remained still. Martin immediately objected. Circumstantial. Rebecca nodded slightly. Then perhaps metadata timing from the recovered audio backup will interest you more. That changed the room. Ryan turned toward his attorney sharply. Tiny movement, fast but visible. Scott noticed Rebecca noticing it too. The court reporter continued typing steadily, while silence thickened across the conference table. Rebecca spoke again. Mr. Mercer, did you ever represent Fleet Shield AI architecture as independently developed without exposure to RouteHawk systems? Yes. Rebecca opened the final binder. Interesting? She slid printed source chronology across the table. Garage access logs, remote request attempts, metadata records, investor presentation screenshots. Everything aligned, everything dated, everything documented. Ryan stopped pretending to relax now. Scott could see it clearly. The shoulders slightly tighter, the breathing shallower. Rebecca leaned back calmly. The issue here is not whether logistics fraud detection concepts can exist independently. She folded her hands. The issue is whether Mr. Mercer commercially leveraged privileged exposure while publicly misrepresenting developmental originality. Martin Keene rubbed his forehead slowly. Vanessa looked between them in visible confusion now. This is ridiculous, she said suddenly. Ryan built Fleet Shield himself. Rebecca turned toward her carefully. Mrs. Foster, how technically involved were you in RouteHawk development? Vanessa frowned. I wasn't. And how technically involved were you in Fleet Shield development? Another pause. I wasn't. Rebecca nodded once. Then your conclusions regarding originality are emotional, not evidentiary. That hit harder than shouting would have. Vanessa flushed immediately. Scott remained completely silent beside Rebecca. That silence became its own pressure now, because the more emotional everyone else became, the calmer Scott appeared. And calm people with records frightened professionals. Martin Keene requested a short recess 40 minutes later. The moment the attorney stepped outside, Vanessa turned sharply toward Scott. You're trying to ruin us. Scott looked at her for several seconds before answering. No, that's exactly what this is. Scott glanced toward the binders stacked across the table. You called RouteHawk worthless. Vanessa's expression tightened instantly. That was during the divorce. You signed it. You know what I meant. Scott answered quietly. No, I know exactly what you signed. Vanessa stared at him, probably expecting anger, or revenge, or triumph. Scott offered none of it. That unsettled her more. When the attorneys returned, Martin Keene looked different, less aggressive, more cautious. Rebecca noticed immediately. So did Scott. The second half of the deposition focused heavily on investor communications. Rebecca introduced archived emails showing Ryan privately discussing RouteHawk's market potential months before Fleet Shield publicly launched. Then came the most damaging section, a confidential Fleet Shield investor memo obtained during discovery. Scott watched Ryan's face carefully as Rebecca handed copies across the table. Page 4 contained one sentence, highlighted in yellow. Mercer's exposure to independent logistics fraud architecture significantly accelerated Fleet Shield development timeline. No direct mention of Scott, no explicit admission, but enough. Martin closed the folder slowly. Ryan finally spoke again. Quiet now, measured. What exactly do you want? Rebecca answered immediately. Truthful disclosure during acquisition review. Scott looked toward Ryan. For the first time since this entire situation began, Ryan appeared genuinely uncertain, not defeated, not yet, but unstable. Rebecca gathered her papers methodically. We will continue formal proceedings after Northstar completes due diligence. Martin looked exhausted suddenly. You're coordinating with them. Rebecca gave a very small smile. We coordinate with documentation. Another precision strike. Nothing technically improper, still devastating. The deposition finally ended near sunset. Outside the conference room windows, Chicago glowed beneath icy orange light reflecting across Lake Michigan. Scott packed his laptop quietly while Vanessa remained seated across the table staring downward. Ryan stood near the door speaking tensely with his attorney in lowered tones. Rebecca closed the final binder. Then she looked toward Scott. Good day, she said simply. Scott nodded once. As they walked toward the elevators, Rebecca handed him a sealed folder. What's this additional server recovery reports? Scott frowned slightly. More access attempts. Rebecca looked straight ahead while pressing the elevator button. No. The doors opened softly. Then she added, evidence somebody inside Fleet Shield tried deleting internal development history 2 weeks ago. Scott stepped into the elevator slowly. Rebecca's expression never changed. But her next sentence landed heavier than anything else that day. People only erase timelines when they're afraid of where chronology leads. Tuesday morning arrived quietly. No dramatic sunrise, no triumphant music, just freezing Michigan air pushing against the windows of Scott Foster's apartment, while an old refrigerator hummed unevenly beside the kitchen counter. The clock read 8:12 a.m. Scott stood barefoot on cold linoleum, wearing gray sweatpants and an old Mid-States Freight hoodie, while coffee reheated inside the microwave for the second time. Outside, dirty snow lined the parking lot in shrinking piles, stained black from highway slush. Nothing about the morning looked historic. That was the strange part. After 6 years of obsession, humiliation, isolation, and legal pressure, the biggest moment of Scott's life arrived looking painfully ordinary. The microwave beeped softly. Scott removed the coffee carefully. Then his phone rang. Unknown Virginia number. Scott already knew. Still, his pulse changed immediately. He answered quietly. Scott Foster. Claire Donovan's voice came through the speaker, calm and professional as always. Good morning, Scott. He leaned one hand against the kitchen counter. We finalized signatures 30 seconds ago. Silence filled the apartment. Claire continued. Northstar Sentinel Technologies has completed acquisition of RouteHawk LLC. Scott closed his eyes briefly, not from excitement, from impact. Years compressing into one sentence. Claire's voice remained steady. Total acquisition value is $340 million. The coffee slipped slightly in Scott's hand. Hot liquid splashed across his fingers and onto the floor. He barely noticed. Outside the apartment window, traffic moved normally along the highway exit ramp. A delivery truck backed into a nearby loading bay. Someone walked a dog through slush. The world continued exactly the same, while Scott's entire life changed permanently. Claire kept speaking. Initial transfers are already processing. Legal announcements release at market open. Scott looked down at the coffee, dripping across the linoleum. Okay, he said quietly, not because he lacked emotion, because there was too much of it to organize yet. Claire softened slightly. You built something extraordinary. Scott stared at the steam rising from the coffee cup. No, he said after a moment. I just kept building longer than everyone expected. After the call ended, the apartment became silent again, painfully silent. Scott remained standing in the kitchen for nearly 2 full minutes without moving. $340 million. The number barely felt connected to reality. He thought about the garage in Novi, the folding tables, the freezing winter nights, the humiliation at dinner parties, the Walmart notebooks filled with shipping anomalies, turkey sandwiches eaten beside glowing monitors at 2 a.m, Vanessa laughing, Ryan recording conversations, warehouse shifts starting before sunrise. All of it suddenly carried weight now. Not emotional weight, financial weight, proof weight. Scott cleaned the spilled coffee with paper towels mechanically. Then his phone exploded. Messages, emails, unknown calls, notifications stacking faster than he could read them. CNBC logistics article alerts. LinkedIn requests. Industry forums discussing the acquisition. Northstar press release. Scott muted the phone immediately. Then it rang again. Vanessa. He stared at the screen while it vibrated across the counter. Vanessa Foster. 3 years earlier, she signed papers calling RouteHawk worthless. Now financial media described it as one of the largest logistics security acquisitions of the year. The phone stopped, then immediately rang again. Scott let it continue. Voicemail notification appeared seconds later. Another call and another. Scott turned the phone face down. At 9:03 a.m., he left for work because he genuinely didn't know what else to do. Mid-States freight distribution looked exactly the same as it had the day before. Forklifts crossing loading lanes, diesel fumes hanging beneath warehouse lights, drivers yelling across dock stations, the smell of machine oil and wet concrete. Scott parked his dented Honda between 2 freight trailers and walked inside, carrying the same old backpack. Nobody noticed anything immediately. Why would they? To them, Scott was still Scott, quiet systems analyst, always early, always tired, always carrying coffee. Tyler spotted him first near Operations Bay 2. You hear about some software company getting bought for like insane money, Tyler asked while scanning inventory tags. Scott removed his gloves calmly. No. Tyler laughed. Dude, it's everywhere online. Some Detroit guy sold fraud software for $340. Scott nodded slightly. Good for him. Tyler kept talking while loading manifests into the system. They said he built it himself or something. In a garage. Scott logged into the warehouse routing terminal. Around them, conveyor systems rattled overhead. Eventually, another employee walked over holding a phone. Wait, he said slowly. Scott. RouteHawk. Scott looked up. The man stared between Scott and the article on screen. Then realization spread visibly across his face. No way. The room changed after that. Not dramatically at first. Just pauses, looks, whispers, traveling faster across warehouse floors than formal announcements ever could. By 10:15 a.m., even supervisors knew. One of the freight managers approached Scott carefully near the loading schedules. Is it true? Scott nodded once. The manager blinked slowly. You sold that software? Yes. For $340 million. Scott hesitated briefly. Before taxes. The manager stared at him as though recalculating the past 6 years in real time. That happened repeatedly all morning. Co-workers replaying memories silently. The quiet guy with the old Honda. The man eating sandwiches alone during night shifts. The employee leaving early sometimes for legal meetings. People always assumed invisibility meant insignificance. Scott kept working anyway. At 11:42 a.m., his phone rang again. Vanessa. Then immediately afterward, Ryan Mercer. Scott ignored both. At noon, Noah Bennett called. Scott answered while standing alone beside the freight docks. Well? Noah asked immediately. Scott watched snow drift past trailer doors. It closed. Noah let out a long breath. Jesus Christ. Scott almost smiled faintly. That's basically what Claire said. Noah laughed once. Then silence settled briefly between them. Finally, Noah asked quietly, How do you feel? Scott looked across the warehouse floor. Forklifts moving, workers shouting, business continuing. Tired, he admitted. Noah understood instantly. Yeah. That afternoon, black SUVs appeared outside Mid-States, then reporters, then local business journalists trying to confirm the acquisition story. Management panicked immediately. Scott hated every second of it. He slipped out a side entrance around 2:30 p.m., hoping to avoid attention. That was when he saw Vanessa, standing near the front lobby doors in a camel-colored coat beside melting snowbanks. She looked different from the last time Scott saw her in person. More polished somehow, more tense too. Her expression carried urgency now instead of superiority. The moment she spotted him, she started walking quickly across the parking lot. Scott. He stopped automatically. Vanessa reached him slightly out of breath. You've been ignoring me. Scott kept his hands in his jacket pockets. I've been working. She stared at him. Snowflakes collected lightly in her hair. This is insane, she said quietly. 340 million. Scott said nothing. Vanessa looked almost disoriented, trying to process the number. Then came the sentence Scott expected eventually. I supported you through all of this. There it was. History rewriting itself in real time. Scott studied her calmly. Behind Vanessa, warehouse workers pretended not to watch through the lobby windows. You called it worthless, Scott said quietly. Vanessa's expression tightened immediately. That was during the divorce. You signed it. You know that's not what I meant. Scott looked toward the warehouse doors, then back at her. No, he said calmly. I know exactly what you meant at the time. Vanessa opened her mouth again, but another voice interrupted from behind. Mrs. Foster. Rebecca Hale stepped out of a black sedan near the curb, carrying a leather briefcase. Vanessa turned sharply. Rebecca approached slowly across the wet pavement. Calm as always. Controlled as always. And judging by the folder already in her hands, prepared. Snow melted slowly across the Mid-States freight parking lot, while warehouse workers gathered behind lobby windows, pretending not to stare. Scott Foster stood beside his old Honda with his hands inside his jacket pockets. As Rebecca Hale approached across wet pavement carrying a dark leather folder, Vanessa turned fully toward her. What is this? She asked sharply. Rebecca stopped several feet away. Documentation, she said calmly. That single word immediately changed the temperature of the conversation. Vanessa folded her arms tightly. This is between me and Scott. Rebecca shook her head once. No, this involves legal claims tied to a completed acquisition. Scott remained silent beside them. That silence mattered more now, because everyone else kept filling it emotionally. Rebecca opened the folder carefully. Inside, sat neatly organized copies of divorce filings, valuation statements, and intellectual property agreements, already marked with colored tabs. Vanessa looked irritated immediately. "You brought paperwork to a parking lot." Rebecca ignored the sarcasm. "Mrs. Foster, earlier today you verbally implied contribution rights tied to RouteHawk's valuation." Vanessa glanced toward Scott. "I supported him for years." Rebecca nodded once. "That statement conflicts with sworn financial declarations made during your divorce settlement." Vanessa's jaw tightened. Warehouse employees continued gathering near the lobby glass behind them. Forklift drivers slowed deliberately while crossing loading lanes nearby. People sensed confrontation instinctively. Rebecca removed one document and handed it toward Vanessa. "This is your signed valuation statement dated March 14th. Vanessa barely looked at it. "I know what I signed." "Excellent," Rebecca replied calmly. "Then you'll remember describing RouteHawk as a non-viable hobby project with no meaningful future market value." Vanessa flushed immediately. "That was years ago." "Yes," Rebecca said, "before Northstar acquired it." The sentence landed cleanly, not emotional, precise. Scott watched Vanessa struggle against the reality of her own paperwork, not because she lacked intelligence, because she had never believed documents would matter later. People rarely respected records while feeling socially superior. Vanessa looked back toward Scott. "You're really doing this," Scott answered quietly. "I'm not doing anything." Rebecca slid forward another document. This agreement transferred sole ownership of RouteHawk intellectual property entirely to Mr. Foster in exchange for a revised property distribution benefiting you financially. Vanessa shook her head. "You're twisting context." Rebecca remained completely still. "No, I'm preserving it." A black SUV rolled slowly past the parking lot entrance. Local reporters had started arriving outside the warehouse perimeter now after business news channels connected the acquisition story to Mid-States Freight. Scott hated the attention immediately. Vanessa noticed the cameras too. That made her more aggressive. "I was there while he built it," she snapped. "I lived through all of it." Scott looked at her carefully. "Lived through it." Interesting wording again. Not helped build, not supported, endured. Rebecca noticed it too. "You were physically present during portions of RouteHawk development," Rebecca clarified calmly. "You were not involved in authorship, coding, infrastructure, financing, or architecture." Vanessa turned toward Scott sharply. "Say something." Scott finally spoke. "You laughed at it." The parking lot became very quiet. Even the warehouse noise behind them seemed farther away suddenly. Vanessa stared at him. "That's not fair." Scott's expression never changed. "At Maple and Ash, you called it a garage fantasy." Vanessa looked away briefly. "That was a joke." "You told people I was embarrassing." Her voice rose slightly. "Because you disappeared into that garage every night." Scott nodded once. "Yes." Vanessa stepped closer. "You think money changes history?" Scott answered immediately. "No." A pause. "It exposes it." That one hurt. He could see it clearly. Not because Scott raised his voice, because he didn't. Rebecca closed the folder slowly. "Mrs. Foster, I strongly recommend avoiding any public implication of ownership interest moving forward." Vanessa laughed sharply. "Public implication? Are you threatening me?" Rebecca remained perfectly calm. "No. I'm protecting documented reality before reporters start asking questions." Vanessa glanced instinctively toward the growing cluster of cameras near the warehouse entrance. Fear appeared then. Small, real, not fear of Scott, fear of narrative collapse. Because until that morning, Vanessa probably imagined herself adjacent to success, the supportive ex-wife of a hidden genius. Except the record showed something else entirely. Mockery, dismissal, waiver. Ryan Mercer's name surfaced repeatedly throughout those same records. Scott noticed her calculating it now. The articles, the depositions, the investors, everything becoming connected publicly. Another vehicle entered the lot quickly. Scott recognized Ryan's black Range Rover immediately. Vanessa stiffened. Ryan parked hard beside the curb and stepped out, wearing dark gloves and a charcoal coat, despite the slush and freezing wind. His confidence looked thinner now, more assembled. He walked directly toward them. Rebecca, Mr. Mercer. Neither smiled. Ryan looked toward Scott. You enjoying this? Scott kept his hands inside his pockets. There's nothing to enjoy. Ryan scoffed softly. Right. Rebecca interrupted before tension escalated further. Mr. Mercer, given current proceedings, I advise against discussing acquisition matters directly. Ryan ignored her. This whole thing could have stayed private. Scott answered quietly. You recorded me. Ryan's jaw tightened instantly. Vanessa looked between them. Oh my God, not this again. Ryan glanced toward her sharply, not helping. That tiny crack mattered. Scott noticed it immediately. So did Rebecca. Ryan looked back toward Scott. You really think Northstar cares about your moral outrage? Scott shook his head once. No? Then why keep pushing? Scott met his eyes calmly. Because chronology matters. That sentence hit Ryan harder than accusation would have, because chronology was exactly what endangered him. Not emotion, records, dates, sequence. Everything Rebecca built the case around. Ryan stepped closer. You got lucky. Scott considered the statement briefly, then answered, no. I got organized. Another crack. Small, but visible. Ryan's breathing changed slightly. The smooth confidence he carried for years no longer fit correctly, because confident people controlled perception, not evidence. Rebecca glanced toward the reporters gathering beyond the lot. Mr. Mercer, she said calmly, I strongly suggest you avoid further public commentary until Northstar completes final review. Ryan looked toward the cameras, then toward Scott again. You think this makes you special? Scott answered honestly. No. Snow drifted lightly between them. You spent 6 years telling people I was wasting my life. Scott continued quietly. I just kept records while you talked. That one landed deepest, because it was true. Ryan looked away first, only for a second. Still enough. Vanessa suddenly sounded smaller now. Scott. He turned toward her. For the first time all morning, her voice carried uncertainty instead of superiority. We were married. Scott nodded slightly. Yes. Aren't you even angry? Scott thought about it carefully. The freezing garage nights, the mockery, the loneliness, the exhaustion. Then he answered truthfully. I was angry. Years ago. Vanessa's eyes shifted slightly. What changed? Scott looked toward the warehouse loading docks behind her. Workers moving freight. Ordinary people doing ordinary work. Then he answered quietly, I stopped needing you to understand me. Silence followed, long enough for melting snow to drip steadily from trailer roofs nearby. Rebecca checked her watch calmly. We're done here. Ryan laughed bitterly once. You really think this ends well for you? Rebecca answered before Scott could. It already has. Then she turned and walked toward her sedan. Scott followed after a moment. Behind him, Vanessa remained standing motionless beside Ryan in the slush-covered parking lot, while cameras zoomed quietly from a distance. Scott never looked back again. Inside Rebecca's car, the heater hummed softly while traffic crawled beyond the windshield. For several minutes, neither spoke. Then Rebecca handed Scott another folder. What's this internal Fleet Shield investor withdrawal notices? Scott frowned slightly. That fast? Rebecca nodded. Money leaves before headlines do. Scott opened the folder slowly. Several investors had already suspended pending funding rounds. One note caught his eye immediately. Concerns regarding unresolved intellectual property chronology. Chronology again. Scott leaned back against the seat quietly. Outside, gray snow slid across Detroit streets. beneath a dark afternoon sky. Rebecca started the engine. "There's one more thing," she said. Scott looked up. "Northstar requested final executive review tomorrow morning." Scott's expression remained neutral, but Rebecca noticed the tension immediately. "This is good," she said calmly. Scott stared through the windshield. What if they changed their minds? Rebecca almost smiled faintly. "Scott, companies don't spend months dismantling evidence chains because they're uncertain." She pulled the car toward the exit lane, then added quietly, "They do it because they're preparing to spend extraordinary amounts of money. Money revealed people faster than poverty ever did." Scott Foster understood that within 2 weeks of the acquisition closing. His phone never stopped ringing anymore. Private investment groups, business podcasts, former classmates, distant cousins. Men who ignored him for years suddenly wanted lunch meetings in downtown Detroit restaurants with exposed brick walls and expensive bourbon menus. Scott declined almost all of them. The apartment in Dearborn remained exactly the same at first. Same stained carpet, same unreliable heater clicking through the night, same folding table covered in hard drives and warehouse notes. Only now the bank account connected to Scott's phone contained numbers so large they stopped feeling real after the first few days. Northstar transferred the initial payment in stages. Every transfer triggered new legal notifications, tax alerts, and wealth management calls from people who suddenly addressed Scott like he had always mattered. That part irritated him most. Not the money, the revision. At Mid-States Freight Distribution, people behaved differently around him now too. Supervisors became overly polite. Executives who barely acknowledged him before suddenly stopped by his office, asking vague questions about future opportunities. Even the warehouse cafeteria changed. Employees who once left Scott alone during lunch breaks now invited him to sit with them constantly. Scott noticed every shift. He didn't mention any of it. One Friday morning, he quietly submitted formal resignation paperwork. No dramatic announcement, no speech. Just a printed letter handed to Operations Director Marty Gibbons near the freight docks. Marty stared at the paper for several seconds. "You're really leaving?" Scott nodded. "Yeah." Marty leaned against the office doorway. Hell of a sentence. Scott almost smiled. Outside forklifts crossed loading lanes beneath freezing rain while trailer doors slammed shut one after another. Marty lowered his voice. "You know everybody thought you were crazy." Scott looked toward the freight floor. "I know." Marty hesitated. "Guess we missed it." Scott answered honestly. "No. You saw exactly what I looked like." That stayed with Marty longer than anything else. Scott spent the next month cleaning up his life quietly. First came his parents. Harold and Diane Foster still lived in the same aging brick ranch house outside Lansing, where Scott grew up. The roof leaked during heavy storms. The kitchen flooring sagged slightly near the refrigerator. Harold's medical bills had accumulated for years after heart surgery. Scott drove there alone on a gray Saturday morning carrying a folder from the bank. His mother opened the door wearing gardening gloves despite the winter weather. Scott. He stepped inside. The house smelled like coffee and old wood furniture. Harold sat in the living room watching college basketball with the volume too loud. "Hey, kid." Scott sat at the kitchen table for almost 20 minutes making ordinary conversation before finally sliding the folder toward them. His mother frowned slightly. "What's this mortgage payoff confirmation?" Silence. Harold lowered the television remote slowly. Diane opened the folder with trembling fingers, then looked back up immediately. "Scott, the house is paid off." His mother covered her mouth instantly. Harold stared down at the documents in complete silence. Scott looked toward the kitchen window. Snow drifted softly across the backyard where he used to shovel paths as a teenager before school. "You shouldn't have done this," Diane whispered. Scott shrugged lightly. "You already paid for enough things." His father stood slowly and walked around the table. Harold Foster wasn't emotional publicly. never had been. But when he placed one rough hand against Scott's shoulder, Scott felt the man shaking slightly. That meant more than speeches ever could. The next changes happened quietly, too. A technical scholarship fund appeared at Detroit TradeWorks Institute under anonymous sponsorship. Students studying logistics systems and cybersecurity suddenly received grants covering tuition and equipment costs. No press release connected it to Scott. That was intentional. Noah Bennett discovered another surprise, accidentally. He arrived at his accounting office one Monday morning to find new computers installed, outdated debt balances cleared, and the building lease extended 3 additional years. Scott denied involvement twice before Noah finally cornered him over dinner. "You paid off my business loans." Scott cut into his steak calmly. "You needed better servers." Noah stared at him. "That's not normal friend behavior." Scott shrugged once. "You spent 6 years storing evidence in banker's boxes for me." Noah laughed softly and shook his head. "That's still not equal." "Maybe not." Scott didn't care. Meanwhile, Fleet Shield AI began collapsing publicly, not explosively, quietly, which was worse. Investors withdrew first, then legal reviews expanded, then several clients suspended negotiations after Northstar's acquisition announcement amplified scrutiny around intellectual property chronology. Business journalists started connecting timelines. Articles appeared questioning Fleet Shield's developmental origins. Ryan Mercer stopped posting online entirely. Vanessa disappeared from social media shortly afterward. Scott saw none of it directly. Noah occasionally updated him. Fleet Shield lost another investor. Scott nodded once. "Okay, Ryan's trying damage control." Expected. "You really don't enjoy this at all?" Scott considered the question honestly, then shook his head, because revenge looked satisfying from far away. Up close, it mostly looked exhausting. One cold evening in February, Scott drove back to the old Novi house for the first time since the divorce. Vanessa no longer lived there. She and Ryan had reportedly moved into a luxury condo downtown before Fleet Shield's decline accelerated. The house sat dark beneath bare trees and dirty snowbanks. Scott remained parked across the street for several minutes before finally walking toward the garage side entrance. The realtor lockbox still hung near the front railing. A contractor renovating the property recognized him from recent business articles and allowed him inside briefly. The house felt smaller now, emptier. Scott walked directly toward the garage. Nothing remained except outlines, dust shadows where folding tables once stood, faded marker stains on unfinished drywall, small screw holes from removed whiteboards. The contractor spoke from behind him. "Previous owners leave all this." Scott nodded slightly. Something like that. He stepped deeper into the garage slowly. For years, this space contained his entire future, while everyone else treated it like failure storage. Scott crouched near an old shelf in the back corner. One forgotten plastic bin still remained beneath a tarp. Inside sat notebooks, early RouteHawk sketches, fraud maps, handwritten debugging notes, coffee stains across entire pages. Scott picked up the oldest notebook carefully. Page 1 contained a sentence written nearly 6 years earlier. "Small patterns become expensive if ignored long enough." Scott stared at the handwriting quietly. Outside wind rattled the garage door lightly. The contractor eventually stepped away to answer a phone call, leaving Scott alone inside the unfinished space. He looked around slowly. The garage suddenly felt sacred in a strange way. Not because it made him wealthy, because it held proof. Proof that silence could outlast ridicule. Proof that patience sometimes looked indistinguishable from failure until the final moment. His phone buzzed softly in his pocket. "Unknown number." Scott answered carefully. "Hello." A nervous male voice responded immediately. "Mr. Foster, my name's Evan Cole. I work for Fleet Shield." Scott remained silent. Evan continued quickly. I think you should know Ryan Mercer's trying to move development assets offshore before litigation expands. Scott's expression changed slightly for the first time all evening. Why are you telling me this? A pause, then quietly. Because he kept saying you were just some warehouse idiot who got lucky. Scott looked around the coal garage one more time, then lowered his eyes toward the old notebook in his hand. No, Scott said calmly. I just stayed longer than he expected. The call from Northstar came at 6:47 a.m. on a Wednesday. Scott Foster was already awake. He rarely slept more than 4 hours now, not because of stress in the way people usually meant it, but because his mind no longer knew how to shut down after years of operating in constant problem-solving mode. He stood in his kitchen in a small lakeside rental north of Muskegon, Michigan. The air outside was still dark, the kind of winter morning where the horizon hadn't decided to exist yet. The phone rang again. Scott answered. Mr. Foster Claire Donovan said Northstar would like to schedule final executive integration discussion. Scott leaned one hand against the counter. Integration? Yes, Claire replied. Post-acquisition role alignment and long-term strategic structure. Scott stayed silent for a moment. He had expected this. He just hadn't known what form it would take. We'd like you in Arlington tomorrow, Claire added. Scott looked out the window. Lake Michigan stretched beyond the trees, frozen in long gray sheets under early light. Okay, he said finally. The flight felt different from the first one, not because anything external had changed, but because Scott understood now that everything he said would be interpreted not as possibility but as leverage. People were no longer evaluating his software. They were evaluating him. Northstar headquarters looked even more controlled than before. But now Scott noticed details he missed previously. Security personnel no longer scanned him like a visitor. They scanned him like a variable inside a system they had already begun restructuring. Inside the executive conference level, Claire Donovan greeted him immediately. Good morning? Scott nodded once. The room they entered was larger than the last one. More people this time, fewer questions, more intent. A senior Northstar executive, David Raines, opened the session directly. Scott, we're moving toward full acquisition closure integration, he said. That includes not just RouteHawk, but operational leadership alignment. Scott sat down without reacting. He had learned by now that the people who used phrases like alignment meant control in softer language. David continued, we want you to lead a new division, Federal Logistics Intelligence Systems. Scott blinked once. That was unexpected. Not the acquisition, the scope. Another executive slid a document forward. Compensation structure, equity allocation, security clearance requirements, operational authority limits. Numbers that would have once felt impossible to Scott were now printed in standard formatting as if they belonged in the same reality as anything else. Still, he didn't respond immediately. That hesitation made the room quieter. Claire noticed it. You're not reacting like most founders do, she said. Scott looked up. Most founders? She nodded slightly. They usually ask about valuation first. Scott leaned back a little. I already know the valuation. That surprised one of the executives. David folded his hands. Then what are you thinking about? Scott paused. He looked at the documents again, then said something simple. What I lose if I accept. Silence again. Not uncomfortable, just recalculating. Claire studied him carefully. You mean control? Scott shook his head slightly. No, time. That word changed the tone of the room subtly, because money was expected. Control was expected. But time was not usually part of negotiation language. Scott continued. I spent 6 years building RouteHawk in pieces of time nobody valued. Nights, weekends, empty hours. If I take this, I want to know what I stop becoming. No one interrupted. That was new for Scott. People usually interrupted him when he stopped speaking in technical terms. David leaned forward slightly. You become someone who scales what you built. Scott nodded. That's one version. Another executive spoke. There are others. Scott looked toward the window behind them. Washington was gray again, always gray. There's always another version, he said quietly. The room went still. Claire broke the silence gently. You've already seen what happens when you don't scale it yourself. Scott understood what she meant. Ryan Mercer, Fleet Shield, the legal collapse, the exposure, the attention. But Scott didn't fully accept that framing. Because in his mind, what happened to Ryan wasn't about failure to scale. It was about misunderstanding exposure to truth. Scott finally spoke again. What happens to RouteHawk if I don't accept? David answered carefully. It becomes a Northstar system, fully integrated. Scott nodded. And me, Claire, answered this time. You step into advisory role only. Scott leaned forward slightly. That part mattered, because advisory roles meant distance, and distance meant losing control over what came next. He looked down at the documents again. Then something unexpected happened. He thought about Vanessa, not angrily, not nostalgically, just clearly, about how easily people misread silence as absence of ambition, about how easily they misread repetition as lack of intelligence, about how Ryan thought confidence could replace documentation. Scott realized something then. This wasn't about proving anyone wrong anymore. That phase was already complete. This was about deciding what kind of system he wanted to exist inside of next. David spoke again. There is also one more matter. Scott looked up. Claire slid another folder forward. Fleet Shield litigation update, she said. Scott opened it slowly. Inside were internal summaries from Northstar's legal division. Pressure had escalated. Investors had begun exiting publicly. Federal review interest had expanded beyond logistics, oversight into cybersecurity infrastructure concerns. Ryan Mercer's position was weakening faster than expected, but one line stood out. Potential asset relocation attempt detected. Scott closed the folder slowly. Claire watched him carefully. You've been correct about chronology from the beginning, she said, but now it's becoming legally actionable. Scott nodded once, then spoke quietly. I didn't want it to become personal. Claire tilted her head slightly. It never stays impersonal at this level. That was true. Scott knew that. That was why he had avoided this level for so long. Not because he couldn't operate there, but because operating there changed everything around it. The meeting continued for another hour. Compensation adjustments, authority boundaries, security clearance transitions. Each topic layered carefully over the last like controlled architecture. When it ended, Claire walked Scott toward the elevator. You didn't say yes yet, she observed. Scott stepped inside. I didn't say no either. Claire gave a small nod. That's rare. The elevator doors closed. Scott rode down alone. He didn't feel excitement. He didn't feel fear. He felt something closer to structural awareness, like standing inside a system before it fully reorganized itself around him. That evening, Scott returned to his hotel room overlooking the Potomac. He didn't turn on the TV. Instead, he opened his laptop and checked RouteHawk's latest activity logs. The system was now partially mirrored inside Northstar infrastructure. That meant something subtle had changed. Ownership was no longer absolute. It was shared architecture. He studied the logs quietly. Then a message appeared. Unknown internal Northstar channel request. Approval pending. Scott frowned slightly. He clicked it open. It was a draft organizational chart. His name appeared at the top of a new division structure, Federal Logistics Intelligence Systems. Beneath it, hundreds of projected roles, teams, budget lines, clearance levels. Scott stared at it for a long time. Not because it was impressive, because it was irreversible if accepted. His phone buzzed. Unknown number again. He answered. Ryan Mercer's voice came through immediately. "Congratulations," Ryan said. Scott didn't respond. Ryan continued. "I hear you're moving into government-level integration now." Scott leaned back in the chair. "Where did you hear that?" Ryan laughed softly. "You think Northstar keeps things quiet." Scott looked out the window at Washington lights reflecting across wet pavement. "What do you want?" A pause. Then Ryan spoke more carefully. "You and I don't have to be enemies." Scott closed his eyes briefly. That sentence sounded almost rehearsed. He replied calmly, "We already are." Silence. Then Ryan's tone changed slightly. "You don't understand what happens next." Scott opened his eyes. "I understand enough." Another pause. Then Ryan said something quieter. "You think documentation protects you forever?" Scott stood up slowly and walked toward the window. Outside, traffic moved along the river. People lived inside assumptions. Scott answered calmly, "No, I think it narrows outcomes." A longer silence this time. Then the call ended. Scott placed the phone down. He looked at the Northstar draft chart again, then closed the laptop. For the first time in a long time, he didn't immediately replace silence with work. Instead, he simply stood in the room and allowed the weight of everything to exist at once, not as victory, not as revenge, but as consequence. Outside, Washington continued moving without acknowledging any of it. The house Scott Foster chose sat on the western edge of Lake Michigan, where the shoreline curved into long stretches of quiet gray water and wind-carved sand. It wasn't large, it wasn't impressive, it didn't need to be. Most mornings the only sound came from distant waves breaking against frozen edges of ice that never fully decided whether to melt or stay solid. Scott arrived there alone on a late Saturday afternoon in early spring. Northstar's integration offer was still technically open. Ryan Mercer's legal situation was still unfolding in layers of corporate pressure and federal review escalation. Vanessa had stopped contacting him entirely after the last deposition phase. The world that once surrounded Scott with noise had slowly reorganized itself into distance. He preferred it that way. The house was simple: wooden structure, large windows facing the lake, a small garage detached from the main building. When Scott first walked inside, he stood still for a long time without unpacking anything. Not because he was overwhelmed, because he wasn't used to arriving anywhere without an immediate problem to solve. Now there was no immediate problem, only space. That was unfamiliar. The first night he sat on the floor beside unopened boxes while the wind pushed cold air through thin seams of the window frame. He didn't turn on music, didn't check emails, didn't open logs. Instead, he just listened. The absence of urgency felt almost artificial. By the third morning, he started a routine without planning it. Coffee at 5:30 a.m., walk along the shoreline at 6, return by 7, sit at a plain wooden table facing the water. Think, not in systems, not in diagrams, just thoughts. Noah visited 2 weeks later. He drove up in an old pickup truck, stepping out into wind that immediately pulled at his jacket. "You picked a place where the weather hates people," Noah said. Scott nodded slightly. "That's accurate." They stood on the porch for a moment, watching the lake shift under pale light. Noah finally spoke again. "So what now?" Scott didn't answer immediately. That question had followed him longer than any legal filing or acquisition document. What now? Not what happened, not what was built, but what continued after everything stabilized. "I don't know yet," Scott said finally. Noah studied him carefully. "That's new." Scott gave a faint nod. "Yes?" Inside the house, nothing was urgent. No monitors blinking, no servers humming, no dashboards. tracking invisible patterns of fraud across national logistics networks. Just silence shaped by wind and water. Northstar officially finalized integration paperwork 1 month later. Scott declined full executive leadership. That decision surprised many people. It didn't surprise Rebecca Hale. When she called him afterward, her voice carried the same calm precision as always. "You understand what you're giving up?" she said. Scott stood by the kitchen window looking at the lake. "Yes." "And you're still choosing advisory-level involvement?" "Yes." Rebecca paused briefly. Why Scott considered the question longer than most people would expect. Then answered honestly, "Because I don't want my entire life to become a structure that only exists inside corporate systems." Rebecca didn't respond immediately. When she did, her tone softened slightly. "That's the first time you've sounded uncertain." Scott almost smiled. "I'm not uncertain," he said. "I'm just finished proving things." There was a brief silence on the line. Then Rebecca said something unusual for her. "Good." And the call ended. Spring turned slowly into early summer. Scott spent most days working in a small study overlooking the lake, occasionally consulting Northstar teams on architecture stability and logistics intelligence systems. But the intensity was gone. What remained was refinement. One afternoon, an envelope arrived without return branding. Inside was a handwritten letter, Vanessa Foster. Scott didn't open it immediately. He placed it on the table and sat across from it for nearly 20 minutes. Eventually, he unfolded it. The handwriting was smaller than he remembered, less confident, more careful. She wrote about misunderstanding him, about assuming silence meant lack of ambition, about Ryan Mercer, about choices made too quickly in rooms filled with people who sounded certain. There was no demand in the letter, no legal tone, just reflection. At the bottom she wrote, "I don't expect anything from you. I just wanted you to know I finally understand what I didn't see." Scott read the line twice, then folded the letter back exactly as it had been. He placed it inside a drawer, not destroyed, not answered, just stored. Later that evening, he walked down to the shoreline. The lake stretched out endlessly in front of him, reflecting the fading orange of sunset in fractured pieces across small waves. There was no applause, no investors, no courtroom tension, no recordings, no accusations, only water moving forward without explanation. Scott stood there a long time. He thought about everything that had led here. 6 years of building in silence, 6 years of being misunderstood, then months of acceleration that changed everything too quickly for most people to process. But what stayed with him wasn't the acquisition, or the money, or even the legal battles. It was something simpler. The fact that most people had evaluated him incorrectly the entire time. Not because they lacked intelligence, but because they lacked patience. Scott turned slightly as wind moved across the shoreline. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like he was waiting for anything to happen next, because there was nothing left to prove, only things to build if he chose to. Noah called him that night. "You watching the news?" Noah asked. "No?" "They're still talking about Fleet Shield fallout." Scott leaned against the wooden railing outside the house. "I expected that." Noah hesitated. "You okay out there alone?" Scott looked at the lake. "Yeah," he said quietly. "It's quieter than I thought it would be." Noah laughed softly. "That sounds like a complaint." "It's not," Scott replied. "It's an adjustment." After the call ended, Scott remained outside for a long time. The stars appeared slowly above the lake as the sky darkened into deep blue. Somewhere far inland, systems continued running. Logistics networks still moved freight across states. Companies still fought over data. People still misunderstood each other in conference rooms. But here everything was simple. Scott finally understood something he hadn't before. Being underestimated wasn't the story. What mattered was what you built while nobody was watching, and whether you needed them to watch at all once it was done. Inside the house, his laptop sat closed on the wooden table. Unopened notifications waited quietly, but Scott didn't open them. Instead, he turned off the lights and let the night exist without interruption. Scott Foster's story is not about revenge or sudden success. It is about patience in a world that misunderstands silence. People around him confused quiet behavior with failure and repetition with lack of intelligence. But time proved something different. Consistent work, even when ignored, compounds in ways most people never notice until it's too late. In real life, many people stop too early, not because they cannot succeed, but because they want recognition while still building. Scott's journey shows that validation often arrives after the result, not during the process. For viewers watching this story is a reminder that being underestimated is not a limitation. It is often just a delay in other people's understanding of your direction. Have you ever been in a situation where people doubted something you were building or working on? Share your country and your story in the comments. And if you enjoy long-form storytelling about quiet success, hidden persistence, and unexpected outcomes, subscribe because the next story will go even deeper into what people never see coming.